A millionaire found a mother desperate, in the rain, with her 2 children. What he discovered about her left him speechless. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Enjoy the journey. The rain hammered down like a relentless symphony, drowning out every sound except the occasional rumble of thunder. The city streets, usually alive with movement, were eerily quiet, save for the steady hum of Arthur Benson's luxury car slicing through the downpour. Arthur, a man whose life was defined by control and precision, gripped the wheel tightly, his mind preoccupied with the weight of his success. He had spent years building an empire, but nights like these reminded him how hollow it sometimes felt. Just as he turned a corner, something caught his eye in the blur of rain-soaked headlights. A figure stood on the sidewalk, hunched over with an umbrella that was more holes than fabric. Beneath it, 2 small children clung to the woman, their tiny bodies shivering from the cold. The sight was jarring, a snapshot of desperation in the middle of his carefully curated world. Arthur slowed the car, his brow furrowing. "What on earth?" he muttered. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. Stepping out, the icy rain immediately soaked through his tailored overcoat, but he didn't care. He approached cautiously, his voice cutting through the storm. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The woman startled, clutching her children tighter. Her face, partially hidden by the shadows and the hood of her drenched jacket, turned toward him. Her eyes, hollow yet fiercely protective, locked onto his. We're fine," she stammered, her voice trembling as much as her body. "Please, just leave us." Arthur wasn't convinced. The children, their cheeks pale and their clothes clearly inadequate for the freezing weather, were huddled against her legs. The little girl looked up at him, her lips tinged blue, her gaze pleading without a word. "You don't look fine," Arthur said, his voice softer now. "What are you doing out here in this storm? Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the children. Finally, she whispered, "We were headed to the shelter, but it's full. There's nowhere else." Arthur felt a pang of guilt, a foreign emotion for a man accustomed to dealing in facts and figures, not human suffering. "You can't stay out here," he said firmly. "Get in the car. I'll take you somewhere safe." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between him and her children. "We don't need charity," she said, her voice tinged with pride despite her circumstances. "This isn't charity," Arthur replied. "It's common sense. Look at your kids. They're freezing. Let me help." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the risks. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Arthur opened the back door of his car, and she ushered the children inside before climbing in herself. The warmth of the leather seats enveloped them, a stark contrast to the icy rain outside. As Arthur resumed driving, the silence in the car was palpable. The children, now wrapped in a blanket Arthur had found in the trunk, began to relax, their small faces slowly regaining color. The woman, however, sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. "What's your name?" Arthur asked after a few minutes. She hesitated, then replied, "Clara." Arthur nodded, glancing at her in the rear-view mirror. "Clara, where were you staying before all this?" "Nowhere permanent," she said quietly. "We've been moving around." Her voice held a mix of shame and exhaustion, and Arthur decided not to press further. Instead, he focused on getting them to his home. His sprawling mansion wasn't far, but it might as well have been a world away from the reality Clara and her children had been living. When they arrived, Arthur's housekeeper, Mrs. Green, opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of the drenched trio. "Mr. Benson, what's going on?" "They'll be staying here tonight," Arthur said simply. "Prepare the guest room, and see if we have any clothes that might fit the kids." Mrs. Green nodded, her expression softening as she looked at the children. "Of course." Clara looked at Arthur, her face a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly. "But we won't stay long." Arthur waved her off. "We'll talk about it tomorrow. For now, just get some rest." As Mrs. Green led Clara and the children inside, Arthur lingered in the foyer, staring out into the storm. He couldn't shake the image of them on the sidewalk. The sheer vulnerability of it all. It was a sight that didn't belong in his neatly ordered life. Yet here it was, demanding his attention. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound of the rain outside was replaced by the memory of Clara's haunted eyes. Arthur had always believed that his success insulated him from the chaos of the world, but tonight, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The morning light filtered gently through the towering windows of Arthur's estate, casting long shadows over the polished marble floors. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside crisp and calm, but the echoes of the previous night lingered in the house. In a quiet corner of the guest quarters, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her posture tense despite the luxurious surroundings. Her 2 children were nearby, curled up on the sofa, their faces peaceful in sleep. A rare sight she had almost forgotten could exist. The soft knock on the door startled her. She stiffened, instinctively clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Come in," she said cautiously. Mrs. Green entered, carrying a tray laden with breakfast. Warm toast, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. The aroma filled the room, making Clara realize just how hungry she was. "Good morning," the housekeeper said with a kind smile. "I thought you might need this." Clara hesitated before nodding. "Thank you," she murmured. She glanced at her children, her expression softening. "They'll be hungry when they wake up." Mrs. Green placed the tray on the small table by the window. "There's plenty for all of you. Let me know if you need anything else." As the door clicked shut, Clara sat in silence, staring at the food. It had been weeks since she'd seen a meal this plentiful. Her chest tightened with a mix of gratitude and discomfort. This wasn't her world. It felt borrowed, temporary, and fragile. Downstairs, Arthur sat in his study, his mind preoccupied with the events of the night before. He was a man who thrived on solving problems, but Clara's situation was unlike anything he'd encountered. His success had always been measured in numbers, deals, and growth. Now, faced with her quiet desperation, he found himself grappling with something far more human and far less straightforward. A light knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Green stepped in, her expression hesitant. "The young woman, Clara, seems uneasy," she said. "I thought you might want to check on her." Arthur nodded, closing the file in front of him. "Thank you. I'll speak with her." He found Clara still seated by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The children were now awake, nibbling on pieces of toast and whispering to each other. The sight brought a faint smile to Arthur's face, but as he approached, Clara's shoulders tensed. "Good morning," he said, his tone measured. "I hope you all slept well." Clara nodded, but avoided his gaze. "We did. Thank you for everything. We'll be out of your way soon." Arthur frowned, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. "You don't have to rush," he said gently. "You're safe here." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We've learned not to stay where we're not wanted." "You're not unwanted," Arthur replied, his voice firm. "You and your children deserve better than what you've been through." Clara finally looked up, her eyes weary but guarded. "And what do you know about what we've been through?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You live in a world where people like us don't exist." The words stung, but Arthur didn't flinch. "You're right," he admitted. "I've lived in a bubble. But last night, I saw something I couldn't ignore. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Clara's defenses softened slightly, though her wariness remained. "We've been through a lot," she said quietly. "My husband died 2 years ago. Since then, it's been difficult." Arthur nodded, giving her space to continue. When she didn't, he leaned forward. "What happened?" She hesitated, glancing at her children as if weighing how much to share. He worked hard, too hard, maybe. He was injured on the job and never recovered. After he passed, the bills piled up. I tried to keep up, but her voice faltered. I sold everything we had, but it was never enough. We lost the house and the shelters. They're full more often than not. Arthur's jaw tightened as he listened. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but Clara's story was a stark reminder of how much he didn't know. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "You've been through more than anyone should." Clara shrugged, her eyes distant. "I've stopped expecting life to be fair." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The children's soft laughter as they shared a joke about their breakfast broke the silence, a bittersweet sound in the heavy air. Arthur leaned back, his mind racing. He had built an empire from nothing, clawing his way out of poverty with relentless determination. But Clara's struggles reminded him of the cracks in a system he had once believed was fair to those who worked hard enough. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," he said finally. "Stay here for now. Let me help you figure out the next steps." Clara stared at him, her brow furrowed. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts suspicion and curiosity. "Why would you do that for us?" Arthur hesitated before answering. "Maybe I see a bit of myself in you," he said honestly. "Or maybe I'm just tired of looking the other way." Clara's defenses wavered, and for the first time, a flicker of trust crossed her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Arthur nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll leave you to your breakfast. If you need anything, let Mrs. Green know." As he left, Clara watched him go, her thoughts a whirlwind of gratitude, doubt, and something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The morning sunlight painted Arthur's sprawling garden in hues of gold and green. Clara stood at the guest room window, her arms crossed as she watched her children run barefoot on the manicured lawn. Their laughter echoed through the air, a sound so foreign to her ears that it felt like a dream. She couldn't remember the last time they had played so freely, unburdened by the constant weight of survival. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as Arthur stepped inside. He carried an air of calm authority, but his expression was softer than the night before. "Good morning," he greeted, nodding toward the children outside. "They seem happy." Clara managed a faint smile, her voice subdued. "It's been a while since they had a reason to be." Arthur studied her for a moment, his sharp gaze taking in the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. "Can we talk?" he asked, gesturing toward the small seating area in the room. Clara hesitated, her instincts urging her to keep her guard up. But there was something about Arthur's demeanor, an earnestness she couldn't quite dismiss. With a small nod, she followed him to the chairs and sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Clara, I don't want to pry, but I think I need to understand what brought you to where you are now. You mentioned your husband last night. Tell me about him." Clara's shoulders tensed at the mention of Daniel, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. Her gaze dropped to her hands as she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel was everything. A hard worker, a good father. He'd do anything for us." Arthur nodded, encouraging her to continue. He worked at a factory, long hours, always pushing himself to provide. "But 2 years ago, there was an accident," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "The machinery malfunctioned. He was crushed. They said it was quick. But," she stopped, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. Arthur's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected the story to hit him so hard. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been devastating." Clara wiped her eyes quickly, as though ashamed of her vulnerability. "It was. After he died, everything fell apart. The bills didn't stop just because he was gone. I tried to keep up. I sold our furniture, our car, anything we didn't absolutely need. But it wasn't enough. The landlord gave us 2 weeks to leave. Arthur clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. And no one stepped in to help. Clara gave a bitter laugh, her gaze hardening. People love to offer sympathy, but when it comes to action, they disappear. The insurance company found a loophole to deny his claim. They said it was unfortunate, but out of their hands. She shook her head. We were just another case filed to them. Arthur leaned back, his mind racing. He'd built his fortune on the belief that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But Clara's story was a harsh reminder of the flaws in that philosophy. What about family? Friends? He asked, his tone softer. They tried, at first, Clara admitted. But people have their own problems. They can't take on ours too. Eventually, we became a burden. Arthur exhaled deeply, his gaze drifting to the window. The children were chasing each other around the garden, their laughter a stark contrast to the weight of their mother's words. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, he said finally. Clara shrugged, her expression resigned. It's just life. Arthur shook his head. No, it's not. This shouldn't be normal. The room fell silent, the weight of Clara's story settling between them. Arthur's mind was already turning, searching for ways to help. But for now, he needed to understand more. Clara, he began carefully, what was the factory your husband worked at? Her eyes flickered with hesitation. It was called Benson Manufacturing. Arthur froze, the name sending a jolt through his chest. His family's name, his company. He cleared his throat, masking his shock. Benson Manufacturing. Yes, Clara said, her tone neutral. I remember Daniel mentioning the name Benson a lot. He always said the company was growing because the owner was smart and ambitious. He admired you. Arthur felt the words like a punch to the gut. He had prided himself on building a business that rewarded hard work, but hearing Daniel's story made him question everything. I didn't know, he said quietly, more to himself than to Clara. I didn't know about the accident. Clara's brow furrowed. Why would you? Daniel was just another worker. Arthur's stomach churned at her words. For years, he had delegated the management of his factories to trusted executives, believing they would uphold the same standards he valued. But now, he realized how little he truly knew about the lives of the people who had built his empire. He looked up at Clara, his voice resolute. That doesn't make it right. She studied him, her expression unreadable. What difference does it make now? Daniel's gone. Nothing can bring him back. No, Arthur admitted. But that doesn't mean I can't make things right for you and your kids. Clara's eyes widened slightly, disbelief flickering across her face. Why would you do that? Arthur leaned forward, his voice firm. Because I should have known, and because you deserve better. For the first time in years, Clara felt a glimmer of something she thought she'd lost, hope. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. Thank you. Arthur rose, his mind set on what he needed to do next. As he left the room, his heart felt heavier than it had in a long time. He couldn't change the past, but he was determined to shape the future, for Clara, her children, and the countless others who had fallen through the cracks. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and freshly cut grass as Arthur stood on the balcony of his office, overlooking the city. It had been 2 days since his conversation with Clara, but her words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Just another worker, she had said, and the phrase had lodged itself deep in his chest. Arthur prided himself on being a fair employer, a self-made man who rewarded hard work and ambition. Yet, Daniel Parker's story revealed cracks in the foundation he had spent years building. Inside his office, Arthur settled into his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. The photograph of Clara's late husband, now resting on his desk, seemed to stare back at him, a reminder of everything he had overlooked. With a determined sigh, Arthur picked up the phone and dialed the number of his company's head of operations. "Stephen," Arthur said as soon as the line connected. "I need a full report on the factory where Daniel Parker worked. Everything: safety protocols, accident records, insurance claims, and payouts. And I need it by the end of the day." There was a pause on the other end before Stephen responded, his tone cautious. "Of course, sir. But is something wrong?" "I just want to understand what happened," Arthur replied curtly. "And Stephen, make it thorough." The call ended, and Arthur leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. His fortune had been built on the backs of thousands of workers like Daniel, yet he had rarely considered the individual lives behind the numbers. Clara's resilience and the laughter of her children had struck a chord in him, forcing him to confront a truth he could no longer ignore. His success had come at a cost he hadn't fully acknowledged. Downstairs, Clara sat in the living room of the guest quarters, watching her children build a castle out of wooden blocks Mrs. Green had provided. Their laughter filled the room, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She still struggled to reconcile the drastic shift in her life, from homeless to living in the home of a millionaire. Arthur's kindness had been unexpected, but it also left her wary. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was too good to be true. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Green entered with a warm smile. "Mr. Benson asked me to bring you this," she said, handing Clara a small envelope. Clara frowned as she opened it, revealing a note written in Arthur's precise handwriting. "Meet me in my office at 10. There's something I'd like to discuss." Clara's stomach twisted with unease. What could he possibly want to talk about? Her first instinct was to refuse. She had learned the hard way not to trust charity. But curiosity, coupled with a sense of obligation, won out. She nodded to Mrs. Green. "Think." At exactly 10 a.m., Clara found herself standing outside Arthur's office. She hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly. "Come in," Arthur's voice called from within. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the large windows that bathed the room in natural light. Arthur stood by his desk, the photograph of Daniel in his hands. He looked up as she entered, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs across from him. "Thank you for coming," he began, his tone calm but serious. "I've been looking into what happened to Daniel." Clara's breath hitched, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag. "Why? What does it matter now?" "It matters because what happened to him wasn't just an accident," Arthur said, his voice firm. "There were safety violations at the factory. The equipment wasn't properly maintained, and that's why it failed. And the insurance company that denied his claim? They did so because of a clause in the policy, one that should never have been there in the first place." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "You're saying his death could have been prevented?" Arthur nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, and I take full responsibility for that. I trusted others to handle the day-to-day operations, but I should have been paying closer attention." Clara felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sadness. "That doesn't change anything," she said quietly. "He's gone. Nothing can bring him back." "I know," Arthur said softly, "but I can make things right for you and your children. That's why I called you here." Clara looked at him, her brows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Arthur leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I've already started making changes at the company. New safety protocols, a fund for employees' families who are affected by workplace incidents, and stricter oversight. But that's just the beginning. I want to help you rebuild your life, Clara. Housing, childcare, job training, whatever you need to get back on your feet." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Why would you do that for us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's the right thing to do," Arthur replied simply. "And because I owe it to Daniel. And to you." Over the next few days, Arthur's promises began to take shape. He arranged for Clara and her children to move into a modest but comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood. He connected her with a job training program and ensured the children were enrolled in a nearby school. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of stability, a foundation on which she could build a future. But with that stability came a new challenge: learning to trust again. Clara had spent so long relying on no one but herself that accepting help felt foreign, even unsettling. She often found herself questioning Arthur's motives, wondering if there was some unspoken price attached to his generosity. Arthur, for his part, remained patient. He understood her hesitation and gave her the space she needed to adjust. At the same time, he continued to dig deeper into the workings of his company, determined to uncover and correct any other injustices that had gone unnoticed. One evening, as Clara tucked her children into bed in their new home, she found herself reflecting on how far they had come in such a short time. The fear that had once consumed her was slowly giving way to something she hadn't felt in years: hope. And though she still had doubts, she couldn't deny that Arthur's actions had given her and her children a chance at a better life. As she turned off the lights and closed the door to their room, Clara stood in the hallway for a moment, her heart heavy with gratitude and uncertainty. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt like they might actually have a fighting chance. The early morning sun cast its first rays over the city as Clara stirred in her new apartment. The sound of her children laughing in the next room brought a faint smile to her lips, though her heart still felt heavy. The changes over the past few days had been overwhelming. She glanced around the modest but cozy space Arthur had arranged for them, the first real home they'd had in years. Yet, a lingering unease remained. Could this truly last? Could she trust it? Downstairs, Arthur parked his car and stepped out, carrying a file folder tucked under his arm. He had spent the past week poring over every detail of Daniel Parker's accident, but what he had uncovered only deepened his guilt. There were layers of negligence, broken safety protocols, ignored warnings, and a paper trail of decisions made by executives more concerned with profit margins than human lives. Arthur knocked on Clara's door, the sound interrupting her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, brushing her hands against her jeans before opening it. Seeing Arthur standing there, she felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, apprehension, and a faint spark of trust that had been growing despite her efforts to suppress it. "Good morning," Arthur said with a faint smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Clara shook her head. "No, not at all. Please, come in." Arthur stepped inside, his gaze briefly sweeping over the space. It was simple but comfortable, a far cry from the luxury he was used to, but he knew it represented something far more valuable to Clara: stability. "I've been looking into Daniel's accident," Arthur began, holding up the folder. "And I found some things you need to know." Clara stiffened, her hands instinctively clenching into fists. "What kind of things?" Arthur sat down at the small dining table, gesturing for her to join him. There were safety concerns at the factory long before the accident. Equipment was outdated, and maintenance reports show repeated warnings about the machinery Daniel was working on. Those warnings were ignored. Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. Ignored? By who? Arthur hesitated before answering. By senior managers who prioritized production targets over safety. They knew the risks, but chose to cut corners. The weight of his words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. She had always suspected that Daniel's death wasn't just an accident, but hearing it confirmed brought a fresh wave of anger and grief. "So they killed him," she said bitterly, her voice trembling. "And they got away with it." Arthur reached across the table, his expression somber. "Not anymore. I'm taking steps to make this right, Clara. The people responsible will be held accountable, and the practices that led to this will end." Clara stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind. She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. "And what about us?" she asked quietly. "What happens to me and my kids when all of this is over?" Arthur's gaze softened, You'll have a future, a real one. I've started a fund in Daniel's name to support employees' families who faced similar situations. But more importantly, I want to make sure you and your children never have to go through this again." As the conversation unfolded, Arthur realized just how deeply Clara had been affected, not just by Daniel's death, but by the years of struggle that followed. She spoke of nights spent in shelters, of choosing between feeding her children or herself, and of the overwhelming loneliness that came from being abandoned by those she thought she could rely on. "It's not just about the money," Clara said at one point, her voice raw with emotion. "It's about feeling like no one cared, like we didn't matter." Arthur nodded, his chest tightening. "You do matter," he said firmly, "and I'll prove it to you." Their conversation lasted for hours, delving into the depths of Clara's experiences and Arthur's growing resolve to make amends. By the time he left, Clara felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to hope for in years, a sense of being seen and valued. Later that evening, Arthur sat in his study, staring at the file of evidence he had collected. He had called a meeting with his board of directors for the following morning, determined to confront them about the failures that had cost Daniel his life. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Some of the very people he needed to hold accountable were among his most trusted advisors. But his conscience left him no choice. The next morning, the boardroom buzzed with tension as Arthur entered, carrying the folder under his arm. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this wasn't a routine meeting. Arthur stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding. "I've uncovered some serious issues within our operations," he began, his voice steady but sharp. "Issues that cost one of our employees, Daniel Parker, his life." He laid out the evidence methodically, sparing no detail. The maintenance warnings that were ignored, the unsafe working conditions, the insurance loopholes that had left Clara and her children destitute. As he spoke, the room grew increasingly silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "This is unacceptable," Arthur concluded, his gaze sweeping over the room. "And it ends now. Effective immediately, we're implementing new safety protocols across all facilities. We're also establishing a fund to support employees' families in the event of workplace accidents. And those responsible for neglecting their duties will be held accountable, no matter their position." One of the executives, a man named Richard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Arthur, these changes could be costly." "They'll cost less than another life," Arthur interrupted, his tone firm. "If you disagree, you're welcome to step down." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Arthur knew he was making enemies, but he didn't care. This wasn't about protecting his company's bottom line. It was about doing what was right. Meanwhile, Clara began to see the ripple effects of Arthur's actions in her own life. The apartment he had provided gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years, and the job training program he arranged allowed her to start rebuilding her confidence. Her children were thriving in their new school, their laughter a daily reminder of how far they had come. One evening, as Clara tucked her children into bed, her son looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom, are we going to stay here forever?" Clara hesitated, her throat tightening. "I don't know," she admitted, "but for now we're safe. And that's what matters." As she closed their bedroom door, Clara stood in the hallway, her heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She still had doubts about Arthur's motives. Years of hardship had taught her not to trust easily, but she couldn't deny that his actions had given her and her children a fighting chance. Arthur's determination to make amends didn't waver. Over the following weeks, he worked tirelessly to implement the changes he had promised. The factory where Daniel had worked was overhauled, and the families of other workers who had been affected by workplace accidents received long overdue support. Through it all, Arthur found himself thinking more about Clara and her children. Their resilience inspired him, pushing him to confront not just the failures of his company, but also the ways he had distanced himself from the very people who made his success possible. For Arthur, this wasn't just about redemption. It was about redefining what it meant to lead. The boardroom had grown silent, the tension palpable as Arthur finished laying out the evidence of the negligence that had led to Daniel Parker's death. His gaze swept across the table, taking in the reactions of his senior executives. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided his eyes altogether. But one face stood out: Richard Carr, the factory operations manager at the time of Daniel's accident. Richard cleared his throat, his voice stiff. "Arthur, with all due respect, these allegations are being blown out of proportion. We were under immense pressure to meet production deadlines. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made." Arthur's eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "Tough decisions? Is that what you call ignoring repeated safety warnings? Putting lives at risk for the sake of profit?" Richard's expression hardened. "This is business, Arthur. Accidents happen. You can't hold me responsible for every machine malfunction." Arthur slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Daniel Parker wasn't an accident. He was a husband, a father, and a man who trusted this company to protect him while he worked. And because of your negligence, his family lost everything. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Arthur's words hung in the air. He straightened, his voice steady but resolute. "From this moment on, things will change. If you can't uphold the standards this company should stand for, then you don't belong here." Richard's face turned red with anger. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment, Arthur. This will cost the company millions." "It's a cost I'm willing to bear," Arthur interrupted sharply, "because no amount of money is worth another life. If you can't understand that, consider this your resignation." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Arthur's unwavering stare silenced him. With a huff, he stood and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Arthur exhaled slowly, turning back to the remaining executives. "Anyone else have a problem with these changes?" No one spoke. "Good," Arthur said. "Then let's get to work." While Arthur was confronting his company's past, Clara was beginning to adjust to her new life. The apartment had quickly become a sanctuary, a place where she and her children could finally breathe. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from or whether they'd have a roof over their heads. But the scars of the past weren't so easily healed. Clara often found herself waking in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of the struggle to keep her children safe. She would sit by the window, staring out into the quiet streets, her mind racing with doubts. Could this really last? Or was it just another temporary reprieve before life came crashing down again? One such night, as Clara sat in the dim glow of the streetlights, her daughter, Lily, appeared in the doorway. "Mommy," she said softly, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Clara turned, quickly wiping a tear from her cheek. "What is it, sweetie? Did you have a bad dream?" Lily nodded, her big brown eyes filled with worry. "I dreamed we had to leave again." Clara's heart ached as she pulled her daughter onto her lap. "We're not going anywhere, sweetheart," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "We're safe here." Lily looked up at her, her expression serious. "Mr. Arthur won't let us leave, right?" Clara hesitated, stroking her daughter's hair. "No, he won't. He's helping us." The words felt strange on her tongue. She had spent so long believing no one cared that trusting someone, especially someone like Arthur, still felt foreign. But the look of relief on Lily's face reminded her that this wasn't just about her anymore. Her children needed stability, and for now, Arthur was providing it. Meanwhile, Arthur's efforts to overhaul his company were beginning to take shape. He hired independent safety inspectors to review every factory under his ownership, implemented new training programs for managers, and created a fund to support employees' families in times of crisis. But he didn't stop there. Arthur knew that real change required more than policies. It required accountability. He personally visited the factory where Daniel had worked, walking through the towering machinery and speaking with the workers. Their stories painted a bleak picture of environment Daniel had endured, long hours, outdated equipment, and a culture that prioritized productivity over safety. One older worker, a man with calloused hands and a weary expression, pulled Arthur aside. "It's good you're doing this now," he said, his voice low. "But it shouldn't have taken someone's death to make you see." The words hit Arthur like a blow, but he nodded solemnly. "You're right," he said, "and I'll make sure it never happens again." As he left the factory that day, Arthur couldn't help but think of Clara and her children. Their laughter, their resilience. It had sparked something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he had measured success in numbers and growth. But now, he realized that true success was about the lives he could impact. Back at the apartment, Clara received a surprise visitor. Arthur arrived unannounced, carrying a small box in his hands. Clara opened the door, her brows furrowing in confusion. "Arthur, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to give you something," he said, stepping inside. He placed the box on the table and opened it, revealing a carefully framed certificate. "It's a scholarship fund," he explained, "for your children. When they're ready for college, this will cover their expenses." Clara stared at the certificate, her hands trembling. "Arthur, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just promise me you'll use it when the time comes. Your children deserve a future, Clara, and I want to make sure they have one." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that his intentions were genuine. "Thank you," she whispered. Arthur smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me. This is just the beginning." As he left the apartment that evening, Arthur felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. Clara and her children weren't just a chance encounter. They were a second chance for him to do what was right. Arthur Benson's office hummed with a quiet intensity as he pored over a stack of documents late into the evening. The once imposing walls, lined with trophies of his corporate victories, now seemed to close in on him. These weren't just papers, they were lives. Each file represented a family affected by negligence, a story of loss or struggle. For years, he had trusted others to oversee the day-to-day operations of his empire, but Clara's story had opened his eyes to the cracks in his foundation. He was determined to rebuild, not just his company, but his legacy. Earlier that day, Arthur had convened his leadership team once more. The atmosphere in the boardroom was less combative than the previous meeting, but still charged with tension. He stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but firm. "We're not just correcting past mistakes," he began, addressing the room. "We're setting a new standard. Effective immediately, every employee will receive mandatory safety training. Each facility will undergo monthly audits, and any safety concerns must be reported directly to me. No more delays. No more excuses." One of the executives, a younger man named Harris, raised his hand. "Arthur, I understand the importance of these changes, but the cost." Arthur cut him off, his gaze unwavering. "The cost of inaction is far greater, Harris. If you're worried about our profit margins, let me remind you, the people who work for us are the reason we're successful. If we fail them, we fail ourselves." There were no further objections. The room fell silent as Arthur laid out his vision, a company where employees felt valued, where safety was paramount, and where trust could be rebuilt. As Arthur worked tirelessly to implement these changes, Clara's life continued to shift in ways she hadn't expected. Her children, now settled into their new school, were thriving. Lily came home one afternoon with a drawing she had made in art class, a colorful depiction of their apartment, with her and her brother playing in the garden. Clara stared at the picture, tears welling in her eyes. It was the first time in years that her daughter had drawn something happy. That evening, as they sat together for dinner, Clara noticed how relaxed her children seemed. They laughed, shared stories from their day, and ate without the rushed urgency of their past. For the first time in years, Clara felt a glimmer of peace. Yet, A part of her still clung to the fear that this newfound stability could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Arthur stood there, carrying a stack of books. "I thought these might help," he said, holding them out to her. "Career guides, job training manuals, anything to get you started." Clara hesitated, then took the books with a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate it." Arthur nodded, stepping inside. He glanced around the apartment, noticing the small touches Clara had added. A vase of fresh flowers on the table, a row of neatly stacked toys by the window. "You've made this place feel like home," he remarked. Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's the first place that's felt like one in a long time." Arthur took a seat at the table, his demeanor unusually candid. "Clara, I want you to know something. Helping you and your kids, it's not just about making up for the past. It's about creating a better future for all of us." Clara studied him for a moment, her walls beginning to crumble. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. "You could have ignored us. Most people would have." Arthur sighed, his gaze distant. "Because I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking that wealth and power were enough. But when I saw you that night, standing in the rain with your kids, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. My own family struggled when I was young. My father worked himself to the bone, and no one cared about the sacrifices he made. I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone else, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that promise." Clara's eyes softened as she listened. For the first time, she saw not just a wealthy businessman, but a man carrying his own burdens. "You've done more than enough," she said quietly. "You've given us a chance to start over." Arthur shook his head. "It's not just about you, Clara. Your story made me realize how many others have been left behind. I won't stop until every one of them gets the support they deserve." The next day, Arthur visited the site of a newly established community center funded by his company. It was a modest building, but it was equipped with resources for families like Clara's, childcare services, job training programs, and counseling. As he toured the center, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This was tangible proof of change, a step toward repairing the damage that had been done. At the same time, Clara was beginning her own journey of self-reclamation. The books Arthur had given her inspired her to enroll in an online certification program for administrative work. She spent her evenings studying at the kitchen table, her children playing quietly nearby. Each lesson felt like a small victory, a step toward independence. One evening, as Clara sat with her notes spread out before her, her son, Max, approached. "Mom, are you going to school like us?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Clara smiled, pulling him onto her lap. "Not exactly, but I'm learning new things so I can get a better job." "Does that mean we won't have to move anymore?" Max asked. Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded. "That's the plan, sweetheart. We're staying right here." Max hugged her tightly, and in that moment, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just rebuilding for herself. She was creating a future for her children. As the weeks passed, Arthur and Clara's paths continued to intertwine. Arthur frequently checked in, offering support and encouragement as Clara worked toward her goals. Their conversations, once formal and guarded, grew more open and genuine. They shared stories of their pasts, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. One afternoon, as they sat in the park watching Clara's children play, Arthur turned to her. "You've come a long way," he said. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "But I still have a long way to go." "We all do," Arthur said with a small smile. "But the important thing is that you're moving forward." Clara nodded, her gaze drifting to her children. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of optimism, fragile but real. And as she sat beside Arthur, she realized that her journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about growth, resilience, and the possibility of a brighter future. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that seemed to promise new beginnings. Clara stood at the edge of the park, her children running ahead of her toward a crowd gathered near the center. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, a mix of nerves and gratitude swirling in her chest. This wasn't just any day. It was the dedication ceremony for a new memorial and community center, built in honor of her late husband, Daniel Parker, and other workers whose sacrifices had often gone unnoticed. As Clara approached the crowd, she spotted Arthur standing near the stage, speaking with a few community leaders. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod, his expression warm. Over the past months, Arthur had become more than just a benefactor. He had become a friend, someone who had seen her at her lowest and helped her rise again. The children tugged at Clara's hand, their excitement palpable. "Mom, can we go see the statue?" Lily asked, pointing toward the veiled structure at the center of the stage. In a minute, Clara said with a smile, her heart swelling at their joy. For so long, she had worried they would never have moments like this, moments of peace, of belonging. The ceremony began shortly after, with Arthur stepping up to the podium to address the crowd. His voice was steady, carrying a blend of authority and sincerity that commanded attention. "Today is a day of reflection and renewal," he began. "This memorial stands as a testament to the lives of those who built our communities with their hands, their sweat, and their sacrifices. It's a reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect and honor the people who make our success possible." Arthur paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "For many years, I measured my success in numbers, in profits, growth, and accolades. But I've come to realize that true success lies in the impact we have on others. Clara Parker and her family showed me that." Clara felt her cheeks flush as heads turned toward her. She gave a small, polite nod, her emotions a mixture of pride and humility. Arthur continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "This center, named in honor of Daniel Parker, will serve as a resource for families, a place where they can find support, education, and opportunities to build a better future. And this memorial," he gestured toward the veiled statue, "is a tribute to the dignity and resilience of workers like Daniel, who remind us of what truly matters." With a signal, the veil was lifted, revealing a bronze statue of a man in a worker's uniform, his stance strong and his expression proud. The base of the statue bore an inscription, "In memory of Daniel Parker and all who build our world." The crowd erupted into applause, but Clara could only stare, tears streaming down her face. The likeness of Daniel was uncanny, capturing not just his physical appearance, but the essence of who he had been: a provider, a protector, a man who had given everything for his family. After the ceremony, Arthur found Clara standing near the statue, her fingers lightly tracing the inscription. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for doing this." Arthur shook his head. "This isn't just for Daniel. It's for you, for your children, and for everyone who deserves to be seen and valued." Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've changed our lives, Arthur. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Arthur said softly. "Seeing you and your children thrive is all the thanks I need." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Lily and Max played near the community center's entrance. The building was already bustling with activity, families exploring its resources, volunteers welcoming newcomers, and children laughing in the play area. It was everything Arthur had envisioned and more. As weeks turned into months, Clara's journey continued to unfold. She completed her certification program and secured a position as an administrative assistant at a local nonprofit, ironically, one that Arthur's foundation had helped fund. The job gave her a sense of purpose and stability, and for the first time, she could envision a future filled with possibilities. Her children flourished as well, excelling in school and forming friendships that brought a new vibrancy to their lives. Lily took up drawing, her artwork becoming more colorful and imaginative with each passing day, while Max discovered a love for soccer, joining the local youth team. Arthur remained a constant presence, though he gave Clara the space to grow independently. He visited the community center regularly, meeting with families and ensuring its programs were meeting their needs. The work fulfilled him in a way his corporate achievements never had. One evening, as Arthur sat in his study reviewing the latest impact report from the community center, he received a knock at the door. It was Clara, holding a small, neatly wrapped package. "I wanted to give you something," she said, stepping into the room. Arthur raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's this?" Clara handed him the package, her smile warm. "Just open it." Arthur unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a framed photograph of Clara, Lily, and Max standing in front of the statue of Daniel. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note, "For reminding us what it means to hope." Arthur's throat tightened as he looked at the photo. "This means more to me than you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the least we could do," Clara replied. "You didn't just help us. You gave us our lives back." Arthur set the frame on his desk, a reminder of the journey they had all taken together. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "You showed me what it means to fight, to keep going even when everything seems impossible. You and your family have inspired me more than you realize." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "I guess we've come a long way, haven't we?" Arthur nodded. "And we're just getting started." The story of Clara, her children, and Arthur's transformation became a beacon of hope in their community. The memorial and community center served as a lasting reminder of the power of resilience and importance of standing together. And while life continued to present its challenges, they faced them with strength, knowing they were no longer alone. For Arthur, this journey had redefined his legacy. He had built an empire, but it was the lives he touched that truly mattered. And for Clara, the storm that had once threatened to destroy her family had given way to a brighter horizon, one filled with love, opportunity, and hope. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.